Hello again, I'm Trish Triumpho Sullivan, and this lecture is about composition. So let's talk about composition. So far we focused on all the technical aspects of photography, how to work your camera, how light works, how we see, how to see like a camera, how to use your aperture and your shutter, the ISO, all those things that control the three things that control exposure, all the controls on your camera, white balance, all this stuff we've talked about are all technical aspects. But now we're going to focus a little bit on the artistic and the creative side. So we're going to learn about the artistic part of taking photos, and that has to do with composition. So what does composition mean? Well, composition basically means how you fit the parts of your photograph together, right? Your subject, your background, just a variety of different things. So composition is really, really important. And I want you guys to take it seriously, because from now on in this class, remember the first three assignments were about technical aspects of photography. So, how to work your camera and stuff. Light was the first one, light and lighting types, right? Direct, diffused, and fill, right? They're a directional light. The second was more about how to work your aperture and depth of field. So that's another technical part. And remember, aperture is the main control for depth of field. And then assignment number 3 is about motion and your shutter speed, and how your shutter speed can help you describe motion in a still photograph. Okay, so that's all the technical stuff. So starting with assignment 4, which is mimetic sets, we're going to start adding in some composition, and I want you to start working on composition and keep it in your mind. It's really important, okay? So in our world, we kind of crave balance, and our brains are particularly soothed by asymmetrical by symmetrical balance, where things are completely balanced, like a photograph that has all the parts completely balanced. We normally do this a lot in our photographs, and it shows that our brains crave balance. That's why we see a lot of these kind of photographs where the person is right exactly in the middle, right? Your subject is right there. It's equal on both sides, and that's called symmetrical balance, right? That's symmetrical. And these kind of photographs, the problem with, even though our brains like them, and we are soothed by symmetry, we like things to have a nice symmetrical balance. The problem is it's also boring, right? This is like this is, I call this the mugshot photo. Right? It's the same kind that we see on our DMV, our driver's license. How many of you guys like the photo on your driver's license? Usually in my classes, I have at least one person who likes it, but the majority of us don't. Why? For one thing, the lighting is crappy and it doesn't really look like us or look that great. It's not usually flattering photo. But for the other, it's boring, right? It's just that head and shoulders, straight on. You're looking in like as if you're getting a mugshot, right? And they're boring. And our phones are filled, and our cameras are filled with photos like that, yeah, they're nice as a record, right? Just like your DMV photo is nice as a record of your likeness for your driver's license, but it's not necessarily that interesting. It does not have what we call visual interest. Oops. Visual interest is very important for good photographs that you want to look at over and over again. What good are photographs if we never look at them again, right? They're on our phone's clogged up with them. How many of you guys have a phone or a computer that's filled with photographs that you never look at? Right? Almost everyone, right? If you're like me, you also have a big trunk of old-fashioned photos that is filled, photo albums and trunks full of photos that you never look at, right? They're just there. They're there and you never see them. Well, we don't want that. We want you guys to have photos that not only do you want to look at over and over again, but you want to share, say, on social media with your friends, with your family, maybe even blow them up and frame them on the wall, right? So we don't want this kind of a photo, right? What we do want is a photo that has visual interest. And when we see something like this, we recognize it's symmetrical, and our brain kind of moves on. It's like, okay, been there, done that. We're good. I'm soothed. You know, I'm happy to be gone. So we want more interesting visuals, and we want our photographs to have visual interest, right? And to do that, we have to have good composition. Composition is key. And like I said, composition just means how your photograph is put together, how you put those little parts together. Just like if you're composing an essay or composing a paragraph, you put those sentences together. You know, you put words, letters together to make the words to make a sentence, sentences to make a paragraph, many paragraphs to make an essay, but you compose them in a certain way. You put them in a particular order so they make sense and they give some interest to the reader, right? Otherwise, you know, nobody's going to read it. Like nobody would want to read something that was really boring, right? So we all want to have something that's not boring. So symmetrical balance can be really boring, and we want our photographs to have a really good visual interest. That's super important in photography. So let's talk about the 8 elements of good composition. Maybe I should say great composition. So as we're talking about this, the elements of good composition consist of 8 things. The first one is unity. Unity is the important thing because we're putting all these sometimes kind of disparate pieces together. And when we do that, we want them to feel unified. So it feels like your photograph is a unified whole that people want to look at. So unity is very important. Next is balance. Remember we talked about that we crave balance, but we normally want an asymmetrical balance that has more visual interest. All right, we'll talk a little bit more about that. So another component is movement. You can often create movement in your photographs by use of lines, right? Especially ones that are kind of an angle, right? Rhythm. Rhythm is really important. You say, how do you get rhythm in a still photograph, right? Rhythm's something that we have for music. Well, rhythm can actually be created by the repetition of shapes. And we'll get more into that as well. We're going to talk all about this. You know, especially geometric but they can be organic shapes as well. But geometric is especially pleasing for humans. Finally, focus. Right, we want our viewer to know where to focus at. So focus basically means, you know, focus on the subject. We normally want our subject to be in sharp focus, right? So we want the subject in focus. So our viewer has a clue as to what the subject is, what our perception, what we want them to see, right? So focus is important. Contrast. So contrast is light against dark or dark against light, right? So light against dark or dark against light. That's all that contrast is. So that, you know, a really sharp contrast would be, you know, pure black and white. That would be a high contrast. Okay. So contrast is important, and as are patterns. Now, patterns are often thought of as a repetition of shapes. So when you have patterns, we're often talking about shapes repeated. So repeated shapes in your composition, especially when they're the same shape repeated over and over, can create a really nice rhythm. And then finally, proportion. Proportion is really important as well. And we'll talk about that a little bit more. So these are your 8 elements of good composition. Unity, right? We want our composition to be unified. We want unifying forces in there, things that kind of bring it together, okay? We want balance. Asymmetrical is best because it gives more visual interest, but also, you know, symmetrical balance can work sometimes. Some photographs just, you know, you want it symmetrical. Movement, often done with lines, and eye directors, we'll say that. Right? Rhythm, which is often the repetition of shapes, especially geometric. Focus, right? Focusing on the subject, so we know who the subject is. Contrast, light against dark, dark against light. Patterns, which are usually repeated shapes, okay? They could be organic or geometric. And of course, proportion. So all these are elements of good composition. Now, one trick that could really help you a lot with your composition is something that all of us have on our cameras, and you can select it, and I recommend that you do. It's called the rule of thirds. Right? The rule of thirds can help you create great composition because it's a grid that you can put on your camera. You can put it on your viewing screen of your camera. You can also put it on the viewing screen of your phone. So if you take a lot of photos with your phone, this is a huge help for great composition. And the rule of thirds, have any of you guys heard of the rule of thirds? Sometimes if you've had art classes already, you know, from either in high school or in college, you might have heard of this. And what this helps, how this helps to create a good composition is that it helps you create an asymmetrical balance. So you want to put your subject or subjects or important, very important elements of your photograph, whatever they may be, along these lines, right? And your subject should be definitely intersecting with one of these intersections, one of these 4 intersections. So you want important elements along these lines, and you want to make sure that your subject is intersecting with one of these, subject or subjects, and that can create a really pleasing composition, a good composition that gives you a lot of visual interest, right? Visual interest means you want to look at it over and over again. So visual interest. So the rule of thirds is something you can use all the time. I keep that grid on my phone and on my camera view screen so that when I'm composing, it helps me. And there's no reason why you shouldn't. Professionals do it all the time. So you guys, even if you're not professional, should be utilizing a trick that the professionals use all the time. That goes for professional artists, painters, and photographers. So this is something that you'll see you'll also see it in a lot in graphic arts. You'll see this rule of thirds. So start looking at compositions and paintings and photographs and see how often they're using that rule of thirds. You'll be very surprised how often that is. So this is an easy trick, rule of thirds. I want you guys to make sure that you utilize it. It's something that you can do without having to go through a whole lot of gyrations. So remember we talked about when we first started that our human brains crave symmetry. We love things that are balanced symmetrically, and our brain craves that are we feel comfortable when we see those things. However, comfortable doesn't necessarily mean interesting, right? You can be laying on the hammock and be very comfortable, laying in the sun and sipping a margarita or whatever, and that's very comfortable. But is it interesting? No, it doesn't create a lot of interest of laying around on a hammock, right? So other things might create more interest than that. So it's difficult for us because we crave symmetry, but it isn't always that interesting. And one of the reasons we crave symmetry is because we're symmetrical beings. If the things that we find beauty in are really based on us, right? We're symmetrical. We've got two eyes, they're balanced, two ears, two arms, two legs, one nose right in the middle, and one mouth, right? And if I cover one half of my face, right, it's pretty much, well, it makes me two-faced, right? No, I'm just kidding. It's pretty much the same as the other half. And when we look at beauty in our world, we tend to find the people that have the most symmetrical features the most beautiful, right? You don't see spokesmodels in there with a lopsided face, right? Right? It's not attractive and pleasing, and it's probably not going to sell any products. So consequently, we always see these models and spokesmodels that are very symmetrical and very pleasing to the eye for us, right? We consider that beautiful. However, as you know, it doesn't create a lot of visual interest. So we need to do something else. And if we think symmetrical, we tend to think we tend to structure our photographs that way too. We tend to have, like if we have a photograph, say, of a sunset, and how many of you guys have taken a photograph of a sunset, and we put the horizon line right there, right? And we put the sun right in the center. Boring, right? We probably have taken a million photographs like that, and not one of them is hanging on our wall. That's because the symmetry is very boring. And so one of the first things we want to do for a good composition is decide where to place the horizon line. That's really important. And yes, we do have a choice, right? And let's ask first, what is the horizon line? What is it? Well, mostly we'll have an answer like, oh, it's where the sky meets the earth, or where the water meets the sky, right? If we're looking out at the ocean. And it's this line off in the distance somewhere, we can't, it's really an imaginary line, right? We can't see that far to a real horizon, right? We can't see that far. So we're just saying where the illusion of where the sky meets the earth or the water is where the horizon is. But nothing could be further than the truth. You know what the horizon line is? The horizon line is your eye level. Yeah, your eye level. So wherever your eyes are at is where your horizon line is going to be. And you can move it up and down in your composition, right? If I get up high on the second story of a building, right, or up on a mountain, then my horizon line goes up with me. Yeah. If I go down low, let's say I lay down on the ground, my horizon line lowers down because it's always going to be eye level. So whatever level your eye is where you want to place your horizon line. And listen, you guys, very rarely do you want it crooked, right? It makes it feel like we're falling out of your photograph. You want to have a level horizon line, okay? So when you're composing your photograph, remember we're talking about it being asymmetrical. A photograph with a horizon line right in the middle is boring, right? So remember we have that rule of thirds. So how would we want to compose this? Well, how about we'll take a couple of different ideas here. And let's draw in our rule of third lines, right? We'll just do a little dotted line. So I have a choice of where I want to put my horizon line at because I can move where my eye level is, right? So instead of putting it right in the middle, which is symmetrical and boring, I might look at my subject and decide what has the most visual interest. So let's say at this point it's sunset and the sky has these clouds in them, and the clouds are just really beautiful. So I'm going to put my horizon line down low so I can emphasize the sky. And I'll probably put my sun over here because I can move my camera. I can change where I compose things, right? I don't have to just like do that. I can move my camera around, back and forth, up or down, and I can change my horizon line. So let's say I want to put my horizon line right here because the sky is beautiful. And I'll put my sun right in the intersection here of one of the rule of third lines here. So here's my sun, right, intersecting there. So that's one of the rule of thirds. And then let's say I have some clouds here, right? And they're really beautiful. And the rays are coming up through the clouds. And maybe there's a couple birds over here flying. And there's this great reflection in the water. But really what's interesting, the most interesting thing are these rays of light, these beautiful colored rays of light coming through the clouds and making this beautiful. So there I've got a great composition. I've used one of the lines to put one of the elements, which is the horizon on, right? I've intersected one of the most important things, which is the sun itself. And then I've left a lot of room for things, for the area that I want to emphasize, the sky, which happens to be beautiful. I want to emphasize that, so I've left room for that at the top. So that's an asymmetrical balance, okay? And then let's say in the opposite is true. Let's say that that the sky is just blue. There's no clouds, nothing that's really making anything interesting in the sky. But I still want to take a picture of the sunset on the ocean. So I'm going to place my horizon line up here because I notice, and I'll put my sun right in a spot that's intersecting with one of these, because remember we talked about the rule of thirds. And so maybe in this case the ocean is more important. Maybe I've got a couple sailboats, and one of them I'm going to intersect with this, right? Right, there's some repetition of shapes. We'll talk about that too. Right, so maybe in this case the sky is not the most interesting thing because there's no clouds in it, but the ocean is. I've got the sailboats, and we've got the water reflecting the sun, and it's kind of coming out towards you. And so there's our asymmetrical balance, and we place the horizon line, our eye level, right? Remember that's eye level, along one of the rule of thirds lines, right? So you're placing one of the important elements, right? The horizon right there. So there I've just got two different examples of how I can create an asymmetrical balance out of a photograph that would be generally pretty boring if I placed the horizon line in the middle and the sun right in the middle, right? Much more boring like that. And we have a ton of photographs like that, so we don't need more of them. So the first step of creating a good photograph is placing the horizon line. And you guys make sure it's level, right? You want it level. You want it to be level straight across, not going up like this or tilted down like that, because it really makes you feel like you're falling out of the photograph. Okay, so that's a big no-no. So the first thing you do is you're going to place your horizon line. And an asymmetrical balance, I would like to maybe give you another example of that, of an asymmetrical balance. If you can think of it kind of like this, if you had a fulcrum, right? So a symmetrical balance, if it was completely symmetrical, would be equal on both sides. So let's say we have 10 pounds of weight on each side, and it's perfectly balanced, right? Well, an asymmetrical balance, we could do it in a couple different ways. We could have the fulcrum be like this, but we could have maybe two 5-pound ones and one 10-pound one, right? So we have that. It's still balanced, but it's an asymmetrical balance, right? So you've got some kind of equal on each side, so it's still being balanced. And we can also do it by moving the fulcrum, right? We can, whoops, that's pretty crooked. There we go, let's do a straight one. We can move the fulcrum over, and remember when we do that, we could actually do something like this. We could have 5 pounds there and 15 pounds here, right? It's still balanced, but it's an asymmetrical balance. Does that make sense to everyone? So we want that asymmetrical balance. Let me write it down. So the balance in general, and like I said, rules are made to be broken, so it's not like it always has to be an asymmetrical balance, but it does help for visual interest. An asymmetrical balance creates a really good visual interest. So if the first step is to place your horizon line when you're composing a photograph, what would the second step be? Well, if you said place your subject, you're correct. So the second thing would be to put your subject in, right? And when I showed you that example with the sunsets, the subject was the sunset. Right, so we placed the sunset intersected with one of those rule of third intersections, right? Remember we want elements to be along these lines, important elements, right? And we intersected it there. So how does that work, say, with a person? Well, if you just take a picture of someone like that, like our mug shot, right, our big no-no that I told you guys I don't want to see that mugshot photo, right, that's an asymmetrical balance, that's symmetrically balanced. We want the symmetry. So let's say I'm taking a photo of a person. Well, I might, instead of putting them right in the middle, I might put them off to the side. Maybe I have them kind of even tilt their head a little bit, and notice that I've got the head intersected with one of these, right? And then the main thing is right there, and I probably might want to have some other element here that would help to balance it, and I don't know what that is. Maybe I get another person in. Maybe I get another person to kind of be over here. And in this case, if I have two people, I've got this person's head intersected, this person's head is intersected, and I've got an asymmetrical balance. It's way more pleasing to the eye and more likely for us to look at over and over again than our ugly mugshot photo, that our DMV photo that we're just saying, you know, that's a big no-no, right? No mugshot photos. So this is going to be true for all your photographs you take, including our formal portrait. I don't want to see this, no mugshots, okay? I want to see a good asymmetrical balance. So like I said, it's really difficult for us to do this, and that's why the rule of third really helps you to get that going. So let's see, cut the horizon line. So remember, first step in planning our composition is to place the horizon. The second step is to place the subject. So those are the first two steps. And most of the time, the most important thing in your composition, the subject, right, is the largest thing. Right? It's easy to see what the subject is because it's usually large. So we know what the subject is if it's taking up the whole composition. Like, right, if I have, this is my whole composition, my subject was taking up the whole space, the whole format, right, the whole size of it, then everyone's going to know what my subject is, right? There's going to be no guessing. But sometimes it's not that obvious. Sometimes you need to use something to help the viewer understand what the subject is. And in that case, you might need a focal point. So a focal point is something that gets your eye into the picture to look at, to make sure that that the viewer is seeing what you want them to see, that they see the subject, right? Which is a lot of the technical stuff we talked about was making sure your subject's in sharp focus, right? Maybe you blur the background to make sure that the viewer is looking at your subject. Well, that's the technical part. Now we have the creative part where we want to make sure we know. And so one of the ways to do that, right, is to make sure that your subject's in sharp focus, even if your subject's a little far away, right? As long as it's in sharp focus, usually that's a big clue to your viewer that that's where you want them to look, okay? So most of the time we know that it's larger, but sometimes they need a focal point that keys the viewer into where to look. And sometimes focal points are also eye directors. And eye directors are kind of fun. So let's take an example. If you see someone on the street and they're going like this, and they're looking up, what do? You look up with them, right? Like, it's a bird, it's a plane, it's Superman. No, if someone's looking up, your natural desire is to look up and see what they're looking at. Same is true if they're looking down. If you see someone looking down and they're looking all around, and you know, the first thing that you're going to do is you're going to look where they're looking, because shoot, you want to find that $100 bill just like they do, right? So, and if you're the first to get it, then finders keepers, right? So our natural desire is to look where other people are looking. So one of the clues in your photograph could be just where people are looking, right? That could be an eye director. For instance, if I was taking a photo of my grandma, and it's my grandma's 100th birthday, right? She's pretty happy to live to be 100, yeah, and she's at the table, and a lot of different people are at the table with her, and they're bringing the cake out, right? She's got 100 candles on it because, you know, she's up there in age, right? One of the ways, because there's a lot of people in the room, and I'm way back here, you know, back here with my camera, trying to take this photo of Grandma, but there's all these other people around the table, right? So how can I let the viewer know what I want what I want them to look at, like who the subject is? Well, one good way is to make sure everyone's looking at Grandma, right? So all eyes are on Grandma. They're all looking at Grandma and blowing out the candles on her birthday cake. And so when you have everybody looking in one direction, it doesn't matter where the subject's looking, and they don't have to be looking into the camera, right? But if everyone else is looking at Grandma, our natural desire is to look at Grandma, right? So that could be a type of eye director. Right, and that's a good example. Another type is geometric shapes, and in this case, I've done a geometric shape that kind of points to her, right? Kind of going towards her there. So eye directors and a focal point can help. So sometimes you need that to help understand what the subject is. Sometimes focal points can be contrast. Right? Remember what contrast was? Light against dark or dark against light, right? Like an interesting type of contrast might be, let's say I'm taking that sunset photo, right? Remember we talked about having the horizon line in a certain place. Well, let's say I have my horizon line up here. And remember, we have our rule of thirds, so we'll put the sun right there. But let's say I want that my real subject is not the sun. What if it was my little girl who is looking at the sunset, and I'm going to get her in profile, right? So she's looking out there. So if this would be a contrast, I would have a dark profile, right? Because I'm exposing for the sun. And so I would have this contrast of dark against light, right? That would be the contrast. Bright sunlight, dark profile, but you could tell it's my girl. And so that would be, right, my rule of thirds. I've got her intersecting, and I've got the sun intersecting, and I've got important element, right, along that line. So that, an eye director could be contrast, right? And that's an example of some contrast. Right? So contrast. Another one is geometric shapes. We love geometric shapes. And using geometric shapes as an eye director is really great. So let's name some geometric shapes. Let's say we got circle, what else? Square, rectangle, right? Don't try to name some really hard ones. Like, I think the most I can do might be this. Right? I might be able to do an octagon. That might be the fanciest I can do. You know, right? It could be oval, could be triangle. Triangles come in different types of triangles, right? We've got ones where all sides are the same, and some ones that have sides are different. But geometric shapes are great eye directors or focal points. And a lot of times you can use them to frame your subject. This has been something that's been happening in art since art first began. Artists have understood that we like geometric shapes, and we like to see, we like to use them as focal points, as eye directors, to help us know who the photograph is about. If you look at really old religious paintings, right, from back in the day, you'll notice that the artist often uses something. They use a geometric shape, right, to frame the head of the important people in the painting, right? You guys have seen that in religious paintings, right? Do you think people really walked around with a circle stuck to the back of their head? No, of course they didn't. This was a device that the artist used in order to tell the viewer where to look. Remember, back then we had a lot of people that couldn't read or write. In fact, the only people that could read or write were usually like kings, you know, people that were really, really rich, and priests, right? People that were like in charge of the religion and the religious order. And they had to be literate and be able to read and write, but the general public couldn't. So how could they communicate important stories from the Bible and an important, or another religion, maybe from the Quran or whatever? Well, of course we can't really say that, because the Quran doesn't allow, they don't like to have images of people, right? But you'll see this a lot in Christian art, and people did not walk around with circles on their head. It was a device that the artist used to tell the public who the important people in the painting were, right? So they framed the head with the circle behind it, and that would tell the public that, oh, that's the important one. Maybe that's Jesus or whoever the person was. And sometimes they would even another type could be lines, right? Radiating lines and different kinds of lines. So another type of eye director could just be lines, right? Radiating lines, lines that go at an angle, right? L-shaped lines. So a lot of times you would even see, not only would they have a circle behind the head, but they would have radiating lines coming out. So if you couldn't figure out who the most important person was, they're going to double whammy you with it, right? They got a circle, a geometric shape, plus radiating lines, right? To tell you that this is an important person. This is the subject. You need to look at this person, okay? So a lot of times they would use, so we can put lines in here too. Lines can be eye directors, right? We talked about, radiating lines, or different kinds of lines can actually point to the subject, right? Like an arrow might point. You see arrows pointing all the time in graphic design for advertising, right? You can have something that looks like kind of like an arrow pointing at the subject. Radiating lines kind of pull you in. If you look at a famous religious icon, right? I'd say probably the patron saint of Mexico. So like a starburst can get your attention, right? You look at the Virgen de Guadalupe, you'll see like the figure, right, of the Virgen, right? And then you have the starburst around her, right? This is how she's depicted, and if you didn't figure out that she's really important, there's also radiating lines coming from her body in the starburst, right? So if you couldn't figure out that she was important, boy, they pulled out all the stops. They had a burst, they have radiating lines. So lines can be great focal points and eye directors, just like geometric shapes and contrast can be. Right. So we looked at geometric shapes and contrast, L shapes, kind of arrow shapes. And if we want people to look, we can use those things. We can take a photo like down a table, right? So that that geometric shape is kind of pointing almost like an arrow to the subject. So that can really help a lot in letting people know who your subject is. And the other thing you need to show is perspective. And we're going to talk about that in part 2 of the lecture. See you in part 2.